So as you would have learned from my very brief biography before the debate started, I've gone through a transformation over the last little while from being a lawyer to being an economist. Now that's a metamorphosis, some people may say, has both an unpleasant beginning and an unpleasant end. I'm going to replicate that this evening. I'm going to start out as a lawyer and I'm going to switch to being an economist midway through the speech. I'm going to start out as a lawyer because I think the key issue at the moment in this debate is that the government doesn't understand its onus. And I think that has led to a considerable amount of irrelevant material flowing our way. The onus for a government is to prove the topic, but instead, what they think their onus is to rebut potential negatives. That's not their onus. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine the topic tonight had been that we should watch a debate at the Melbourne Business School. Now, their onus is to try to prove that that would be an interesting thing to do. You might think that's a very difficult case to prove at the moment. Our onus is to prove that there is at least one thing better than watching the debate. And we might argue, let's go down to the pub next door. What they've spent all night doing is saying, we shouldn't go bungee jumping. We shouldn't go out into the street and lie in front of cars. They've basically spent all this evening saying what a whole bunch of things would be that are worse than making a profit. What they haven't done is to rebut the case that we've put forward. They've spent all the last week dreaming up ridiculous things we might say and thinking, wouldn't it be awesome if we could rebut CSR? Wouldn't it be awesome if we could rebut fair trade? I mean, speaker after speaker has come up here with all these pre-prepared notes rebutting bizarre left-wing conspiracy notions of things that some people out there might want more than profit. We didn't have to put those forward, unfortunately. It's been quite wasted. We've had this defence of child labour. We've had attacks on all sorts of bizarre notions that apparently are doing the rounds at the IPA or their opponents. So let's be clear, ladies and gentlemen. Their job tonight was to show that companies should focus on profit. That should be their maniacal focus. They should make profit. It's not to say that profit's not a bad thing occasionally. It's not to say that companies should bear profit in mind. It's that companies should make profit. It kind of brings to mind the Adam Smith notion that the invisible hand leads to good outcomes if people act in self-interest. And I think that most of us in this room probably agree with that. But as with the Adam Smith notion, it's a deep insight which is valuable, but there are exceptions. With the Adam Smith notion, there are exceptions because markets have failures. There are monopolies, there's market power, there are externalities. So notwithstanding the fact that in general the invisible hand works and individuals acting in their own self-interest can create social good, there are exceptions. So we wouldn't want to always have individuals acting in unfettered markets in their own self-interest. In this debate, ladies and gentlemen, it's a similar notion. Milton Friedman did have a powerful insight that it's important for companies to focus on profit. And notwithstanding the fact that I haven't met the man, but merely read some of his works, I'm in a position to agree that that's a powerful insight. But much like Adam Smith's invisible hand, it's not an absolute. Now we've put forward an alternative which has been, I think, to our a great insult to us, has been ignored this evening by the government. And we're getting over it, but I want to repeat some of it. And what I want to do now is to switch to being an economist, to lay out the two sides so that I can show you that notwithstanding the fact that there are some bizarre corporate behaviours out there which are worse than profit, there's one which is better, a framework which is better than companies focusing on profit and profit alone, and that's what we think society should be about, and that's what we think would make for a better society and a more productive corporate culture. So why do I say I'm going to become an economist? Because I'm going to think about this in terms of an equation. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds pretty awful, he's going to start taking first derivatives. Well, it's actually more the concept of an equation, and what it is an objective function. And I think it's a useful concept for understanding where the two teams are in this debate. What we're really debating tonight is, what should a company's objective function be, as in what is it maximising, and what are the constraints that should be put on that maximisation? Now, this side is basically saying a company should maximise profits subject to acting legally. That's basically Milton Friedman's broad point. They should maximise profits, they should act within the law. If there are things like externalities, it's really government's job to fix those things up. It's not for companies to have managers making it ad hoc determinations on the environment or on child labour or all those types of things. So that's basically their argument. Our argument has been that there should be a different objective function in two ways. Firstly, what we're maximising should be not profit, but a broader notion called value. And I'll explain why that's the case in a moment. But that's one key difference. We're maximising something different. And that's what my first speaker basically talked about, how we need a concept that's broader than profit. It turns out in practice that when you maximise value, you usually do a pretty good job on profit too. But we need to have companies not focusing simply on profit because it leads to perverse behaviour. The second thing we've said that needs to change is the constraints. We need more constraints. We need to maximise subject to a few more things than just acting legally. And that's largely what my second speaker talked about. There's many other things that need to be considered. So it's quite different to what the third speaker and the government was saying. We're not trying to solely empower companies, although to some degree we are, but we're also trying to put some extra conditions on them. We're saying they need to maximise something different, and they need to maximise it subject to a more comprehensive and nuanced list of things. So let me turn first to this notion of profit. Profit does have a lot of important characteristics. It is a good thing to have it at the forefront of companies' minds. It is true, as the first speaker on the government said, it's important in attracting investment, it's important in directing it, and it's important in sending signals. But it has serious problems in terms of short-term behaviour. When companies maximise profit, they do respond to incentives. CEOs behave in such a way that if they hold massive stock options, they maximise the value of that stock at the time they retire. We see with stock markets, when companies maximise profit, what they have to do is to maximise the share market's infinite horizon expectation of future profits. That's basically what the price is in most people's modelling. How do they do that? They have to build up expectations constantly. They have to constantly create blue sky. They have to constantly ramp up herd behaviour. So profit has serious problems. It leads to short-termism. It leads to speculation. Economics at the moment is booming in the behavioural economics area, in the overlap with psychology. It's quite clear that these are serious problems. We can put 20 people in a laboratory, trading hypothetically the most simple asset, and a bubble will almost always be created. So quite clearly, focusing purely on profit creates serious problems in the markets. And the notion that somehow it was Fannie Mae's concern for unemployed workers that created the global financial crisis is like one of those soldiers in the machine gun nest 20 years after the war's finished in denial. It's just a bizarre way to view the global financial crisis, ladies and gentlemen. The second problem is what constraints? Well, we need more constraints, ladies and gentlemen. We've just heard from my second speaker about the fact that directors have obligations that are far greater than profitability. And for corporate governance to be effective, that has to continue. There are other constraints, like the notion that profits are extremely difficult to tie down, not just in an accounting sense, but in a broader utility maximising sense. Even if your job as a company was to maximise utility for shareholders, the fact that shareholders have a vast range of utility functions, have a vast range of risk preferences, means that the same net present value horizon of income is going to be of extremely different value to different shareholders. It's very difficult to actually implement the simplistic maximisation they're talking about. So what we're saying is that maximising a broader notion, i.e. value and sustainability, is a far better way for companies to operate, and in practice leads to companies that are far more sustainable and ultimately more customer focused and more successful. So tonight we have an objective function on this side which is simplistic, which doesn't work in practice, and which has led to great disruption in both society and the economy. We've put forward an alternative which they've largely ignored, which we believe would lead to much better outcomes.